Most people don't realize it, but the moment the room goes quiet, something inside them starts to panic. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, like a low-grade itch in the mind that demands to be scratched. And this reaction isn't accidental or weak. It's trained, conditioned, reinforced over years of constant stimulation. Because modern life has taught the brain one dangerous lesson: silence equals threat. And so the first thing people reach for when the noise stops is not reflection or awareness, but distraction. A screen, a sound, a voice, anything to fill the empty space before it fills them. Because quiet exposes what noise hides, and what noise hides is the self without filters, without scripts, without performance. And that self is unfamiliar to most people, not because it's broken, but because it's never been allowed to speak. From childhood onward, noise becomes the buffer between thought and action. Cartoons playing while eating, music while studying, conversations while walking, notifications while resting. And over time, the brain forgets how to exist without input. It forgets how to sit with a single thought without fleeing from it. And this is where the collapse begins, not in chaos, but in calm. Because when stimulation is removed, the mind doesn't relax, it rebels. It produces restlessness, anxiety, imaginary urgency, and an overwhelming need to do something, not because something needs to be done, but because stillness feels like exposure, and exposure feels unsafe to a mind trained to avoid itself. Noise addiction is not about sound, it's about avoidance, about running from internal friction, from unresolved emotions, from the quiet awareness that asks uncomfortable questions with no intention of letting you escape. And so people build lives that never allow the question to finish forming. They wake up to alarms, rush into routines, flood their senses with content, and fall asleep to background noise, believing they are relaxed when in reality they are sedated, numbed, kept just distracted enough to function without awareness. And the cost of this constant noise is invisible at first, because society rewards stimulation, celebrates busyness, praises connectivity. But internally, something erodes. The ability to focus without entertainment, the ability to endure boredom without panic, the ability to hear one's own thoughts without immediately trying to change them. And this erosion shows itself the moment external noise is removed, when a person is left alone in a quiet room with no device, no task, no audience, and suddenly the body feels restless, the mind races, the urge to escape becomes physical, and many mistake this for a problem with silence itself, when in reality it's withdrawal. The same kind of agitation seen when an addict is separated from their substance, because stimulation has become the drug and silence has become the detox. This is why most people collapse in quiet rooms, not because quiet is unbearable, but because it reveals dependency. It reveals how little control they have over their own attention, how unfamiliar they are with their own internal landscape, how quickly they need something external to regulate what should be regulated from within. And the brain, accustomed to constant reward signals, dopamine spikes from novelty, validation, and interruption, struggles to downshift. It interprets the absence of input as loss, as deprivation, as danger. And so it creates noise internally to compensate, replaying memories, generating worries, inventing problems, anything to avoid the still point where awareness might settle. Because awareness is powerful, and power threatens the systems built on distraction. The silent samurai understands this early, not intellectually, but through experience, through sitting in quiet long enough to feel the resistance rise and choosing not to move, not to distract, not to escape, allowing the discomfort to crest and fall, recognizing that the agitation is not a signal to act, but a signal to stay. Because beyond the restlessness is clarity, and beyond clarity is control. But most never reach that threshold because they leave the room the moment it starts to feel uncomfortable, reinforcing the belief that quiet is dangerous and noise is safety, when in truth it's the opposite.
Noise is dependency, and silence is sovereignty. Noise addiction also fragments identity because when a person is constantly consuming, reacting, responding, they are never authoring. They become a surface that external forces write upon, opinions borrowed, emotions triggered, priorities dictated. And without quiet, there is no authorship, no internal standard, no personal code, only reaction layered on reaction. And this is why silence feels threatening, because in silence you are forced to confront the fact that much of what you think, want, and fear did not originate from you, and that realization destabilizes the ego, which prefers distraction over truth. Society does not teach people how to sit alone with their mind, because a person who can sit in silence cannot be easily manipulated. They are not desperate for validation, not reactive to provocation, not controlled by the need to be entertained. And so noise becomes normalized, even moralized. Silence framed as emptiness instead of potential, loneliness instead of training. But the samurai knows that quiet rooms are not empty. They are full of signals most people are too loud to hear. Signals about patterns, weaknesses, instincts, and unresolved tensions that once understood can be refined into strength. The first stage of this path is recognizing noise addiction for what it is, not a preference, but a conditioning, not a personality trait, but a learned avoidance. And once seen, it cannot be unseen, because every impulse to check a phone, play music, turn on a screen in an otherwise peaceful moment becomes a mirror, showing how reflexive the escape has become. And the silent samurai does not judge this impulse, does not fight it aggressively, but observes it with precision, noting how quickly it arises, how convincingly it argues, how uncomfortable it feels to ignore. Because observation itself begins the undoing. And in that observation, a shift starts to occur, subtle but irreversible, where silence stops being an enemy and starts becoming a test, not of patience, but of sovereignty. And this is the threshold most never cross, because it requires enduring a period where the mind feels loud precisely because the environment is quiet, where the internal noise screams for attention, and only those willing to stay seated through that storm discover that the noise was never outside to begin with, and that when it finally exhausts itself, what remains is not emptiness, but presence, solid, grounded, unshakable, the foundation upon which mental steel is forged. But that comes later, because first the addiction must be exposed, and exposure always hurts before it heals.
Solitude training does not begin when you choose to be alone. It begins when you decide not to escape yourself. Because being physically alone is easy, but being mentally present without reaching for distraction is where most people fail. And this is why solitude feels heavier than noise, why quiet rooms feel oppressive rather than peaceful. Because solitude removes all buffers between you and your internal state. And for a mind conditioned by noise addiction, that removal feels like being stripped of armor in the middle of a battlefield, except the battlefield is internal and the enemy is unexamined thought. Solitude training is not about isolation from the world. It is about separation from compulsive input, from the reflex to fill every gap with stimulation. And the first stage of this training is always uncomfortable, because the nervous system has learned to regulate itself externally through sound, conversation, content. And when those tools are removed, the system overreacts, producing restlessness, impatience, irritation, and a sense that something is wrong, when in fact something is finally being revealed. The silent samurai understands that solitude is not meant to feel good at first, because it is not leisure, it is conditioning. And like all conditioning, it stresses the system before it strengthens it, which is why most people misinterpret the early discomfort of solitude as a sign they are not built for it, when the truth is the opposite. The discomfort is proof that the training is working because it is exposing the dependency on external regulation that has gone unchallenged for years. In solitude, the mind begins to surface unfinished business, unresolved memories, suppressed emotions, half-formed fears, not as a punishment, but because silence creates the space for these things to rise, and the untrained mind panics at this influx, tries to push it away, label it as negativity, or drown it out with noise. But the disciplined mind does something different. It stays, it watches, it allows the thoughts to pass without chasing them or fighting them, learning through repetition that thoughts are events, not commands, and emotions are signals, not orders. And this distinction is the core lesson of solitude training, because without it, a person is controlled from within just as much as they are controlled from outside. Solitude teaches you to sit with boredom without seeking relief, to endure restlessness without converting it into action, to feel discomfort without assigning it meaning. And these skills are invisible in noisy environments because noise constantly resets the emotional state. But in quiet, the baseline is exposed, and whatever instability exists becomes impossible to ignore, which is why solitude feels confrontational, not because it attacks you, but because it refuses to lie to you. The training itself is deceptively simple. Periods of intentional quiet. No music, no screens, no conversation, just you and your awareness. But simplicity does not mean ease, because the mind will resist with sophistication, generating rationalizations. This is unproductive. I should be doing something. This is a waste of time. And these thoughts are not insights, they are withdrawal symptoms. And the samurai learns to recognize them as such, not engaging, not arguing, just letting them arise and fall like waves. Because every time you stay seated despite the urge to escape, you weaken the habit loop that equates discomfort with danger and strengthen the one that associates stillness with control. Over time, solitude stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like space. Not empty space, but usable space, mental bandwidth that was previously occupied by reaction and consumption. And in that space, something changes. Attention lengthens, perception sharpens, and small details become noticeable again. The rhythm of breath, the weight of posture, the subtle emotional tones behind thoughts. And this heightened awareness is not mystical, it is neurological. The brain, no longer bombarded by novelty, begins to allocate resources inward, improving interoception and self-regulation. And this is where solitude training diverges from loneliness, because loneliness seeks connection to escape discomfort, while solitude uses discomfort to build connection with self. The silent samurai does not romanticize this process, because there will be days when solitude feels heavy, when silence amplifies doubt, when unresolved tensions feel louder than ever, and the temptation to abandon the practice returns. But this is precisely where the training deepens, because each time you remain present through these phases, you prove to yourself that your stability does not depend on mood, environment, or validation. And this proof accumulates quietly, forming a kind of internal credibility that cannot be faked or rushed. Solitude also dismantles the performative self, the version of identity that exists primarily in relation to others, because when there is no audience, no feedback, no reaction, behaviors lose their social incentive, and what remains are choices driven by internal standards. And this transition is unsettling at first, because many people realize how much of their personality was performative, shaped by expectation rather than principle. But for the samurai, this realization is liberating, because it allows the construction of a personal code that is enforced privately, without applause, and adhered to consistently, regardless of external conditions. As solitude training continues, the mind becomes less reactive, not because it suppresses emotion, but because it understands it, because emotions that are observed regularly lose their urgency.
They stop hijacking behavior and instead inform it. And this emotional literacy is forged only in quiet, because noise short-circuits reflection, replacing understanding with reaction. And so the samurai treats solitude not as a retreat from life, but as a forge where the tools for life are sharpened. There is also a deeper layer to solitude training that most people never reach, where silence no longer feels empty or oppressive, but alive, where the mind settles into a steady clarity that is not excitement or calm, but readiness, a state where attention is stable, perception is wide, and thought is precise. And this state cannot be accessed on demand through techniques or hacks. It emerges naturally from repeated exposure to quiet without escape, from training the nervous system to tolerate stillness without agitation. And once experienced, it becomes a reference point, a baseline to return to, even in noisy environments, because the samurai learns that silence is not a place, it is a condition of mind. Society rarely encourages this training because it produces individuals who are less predictable, less reactive, less dependent, people who do not need constant affirmation to stay aligned. And such individuals are difficult to manipulate, difficult to distract, and difficult to control. But for the silent samurai, that is the point. Solitude training is not about comfort, it is about autonomy, about reclaiming the ability to direct attention and regulate emotion without external tools. And this autonomy compounds over time, affecting work, relationships, decision-making, and resilience under pressure. Because a person who can sit alone with their mind can stand firm in chaos without losing themselves. By the end of this stage, solitude no longer feels like something you endure. It feels like something you own, a space you can enter at will, even with others around. Because the training was never about physical isolation, it was about internal independence. And this independence is rare, quiet, and invisible, but it is unmistakable in its effects, and it prepares the ground for the final transformation, where silence is no longer just tolerated or used, but embodied, becoming the source of mental steel that does not bend under pressure. But that comes next, because solitude is the training, not the weapon. And only those who stay long enough in the quiet to be reshaped by it earn the right to carry what it forges.
Mental steel is not built through intensity, motivation, or emotional highs. It is built through repeated exposure to pressure without collapse. And silence is the purest form of that pressure because it removes all external scaffolding and forces the mind to support itself. And this is where the transformation that most people never experience begins. Because once solitude training has stripped away dependence on noise, what remains is raw mental structure, its weaknesses exposed, its strengths untested. And the process of forging mental steel is simply the process of reinforcing that structure until it can bear weight without distortion. Unlike confidence, which inflates and deflates based on circumstance, mental steel is density. It does not announce itself, it does not spike, it does not seek validation, it holds. And the reason most people never develop it is because modern life allows constant emotional outsourcing, stress relieved through entertainment, anxiety diffused through distraction, uncertainty masked by busyness. And while these coping mechanisms prevent immediate breakdown, they also prevent adaptation, because adaptation only occurs when the system is forced to regulate itself internally, and silence provides exactly that forcing function. In quiet, there is no external rhythm to lean on, no timeline to react to, no feedback loop to reassure you, and so the mind must learn to generate its own stability. And at first, it fails, oscillating between overthinking and numbness, between urgency and apathy, because it has never practiced equilibrium. But the silent samurai does not interpret these fluctuations as failure. They are data, signals showing where the mind lacks load-bearing capacity. And every time the samurai notices the urge to escape, to break the quiet, to stimulate the system artificially, and chooses instead to remain present, a micro-adaptation occurs, invisible but cumulative, where the nervous system recalibrates its threshold for discomfort. Mental steel is forged not by eliminating discomfort, but by normalizing it, by allowing pressure to exist without immediately reacting. And this is why silence is so effective, because it amplifies internal pressure without adding chaos, creating a controlled environment where resilience can be trained precisely, like increasing weight on a barbell without changing form. And over time, the mind learns a crucial lesson that most people never internalize, that discomfort is not inherently dangerous, it is simply information. And once this lesson is learned, fear loses much of its authority, because fear relies on the assumption that discomfort must be avoided at all costs, an assumption that silence disproves through experience. Mental steel also manifests as emotional containment, not suppression, but containment, the ability to feel anger without leaking it, to feel sadness without collapsing into it, to feel desire without being ruled by it. And this containment is built in quiet moments where emotions arise without an audience, without justification, without narrative. And the samurai practices letting them exist fully, without acting, without labeling, without dramatizing. And this practice gradually separates feeling from behavior, creating a gap where choice lives. And that gap is the essence of control, because a person who can choose under emotional load cannot be easily provoked, manipulated, or destabilized. Most people believe strength shows in action, in visible toughness, in assertiveness, but mental steel shows in restraint, in the ability to not react when reaction would be easy, to not explain when explanation would soothe the ego, to not perform when performance would earn approval. And this restraint is not passive, it is active resistance against impulse, against conditioning, against the reflex to discharge tension outward. And silence is where this resistance is trained daily, quietly, without recognition. Another property of mental steel is consistency under monotony, the capacity to continue without novelty. Because life is not a series of climactic moments, it is mostly repetition, waiting, maintenance, and the untrained mind deteriorates in these conditions, seeking stimulation, inventing drama, sabotaging progress out of boredom. But the samurai who has trained in silence does not require novelty to remain engaged, because attention has been decoupled from entertainment. And this allows long-term projects, deep work, and sustained effort without emotional fluctuation, which is why mental steel often looks like patience from the outside, but internally it is disciplined focus held over time. Silence also refines perception, because without constant input, the mind becomes sensitive to subtle changes, internal and external, noticing early signs of fatigue, distraction, emotional drift. And this early detection allows course correction before collapse occurs, unlike reactive individuals who only notice problems when they have already escalated. And this sensitivity is not fragility, it is calibration, the same way a finely tuned instrument responds to small variations with precision rather than breaking under stress. As mental steel develops, something else changes quietly, the relationship with thought itself. Because thoughts lose their compulsive grip, they are seen as outputs of the system rather than truths to obey. And this shift is critical because most mental suffering is not caused by events, but by unexamined identification with thought. And silence repeatedly exposes this mechanism, showing how thoughts arise, peak, and dissolve on their own when not fed by attention. And through this exposure, the samurai learns to let thoughts pass without engagement, conserving energy for action rather than rumination. Mental steel also alters how time is experienced, because the frantic sense of urgency that plagues noise-addicted minds fades, replaced by a steadier tempo, where decisions are made deliberately rather than reactively. And this temporal stability creates an impression of calm authority, not because the samurai is slow, but because they are not rushed internally.
and a person who is not rushed internally cannot be rushed externally, which is why such individuals often appear unshakable under pressure, even when circumstances are demanding. It is important to understand that mental steel does not eliminate vulnerability, it integrates it, because denying vulnerability creates brittleness, while acknowledging it allows flexibility. And silence is where vulnerability is encountered honestly, without performance, without narrative. And once faced repeatedly, it loses its power to destabilize, becoming simply another aspect of the internal landscape, known, measured, and accounted for. Society often misinterprets this kind of strength as coldness or detachment because it does not express itself loudly. But the samurai knows that emotional stability is not emotional absence, it is emotional literacy, the ability to feel deeply without being governed by feeling. And this literacy is rare because it requires long periods of unobserved practice, sitting with discomfort that produces no content, no validation, no visible reward. And so most abandon the training long before the steel forms, mistaking the lack of external feedback for lack of progress. The final characteristic of mental steel forged in silence is self-trust, not blind confidence, but earned trust, built through countless small moments where the samurai remained present, kept a private commitment, resisted an impulse, and chose alignment over relief. And this trust changes everything, because when you trust your own mind to hold steady, you stop seeking reassurance from others, you stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, you stop performing strength because you no longer need proof. And this is why those with mental steel often move quietly, speak less, and act decisively when needed, their strength already settled, already integrated. Mental steel is invisible by design because it does not announce itself. It reveals itself only under pressure, when others panic, overreact, or fragment, and the samurai remains intact, not superior, not dramatic, simply steady. And that steadiness is the result of countless quiet rooms endured without collapse, countless moments where silence was chosen over escape, and discomfort was allowed to do its work. And this is the truth most people overlook, that strength is not built in noise, not forged in chaos, but tempered, slowly, patiently, in silence, where no one is watching, and where the only witness is the self that either stays or leaves. And the samurai, every time, stays.
There comes a point in the silent samurai's path where silence is no longer something practiced intentionally, but something that tests you unexpectedly. A moment when the noise drops away, not because you chose it, but because life removed it. A quiet room, a pause, an absence of distraction. And in that moment, the true condition of the mind is revealed. Because the quiet room is not neutral, it is diagnostic. It shows you what remains when there is nothing to react to, nothing to perform for, nothing to escape into. And this is where most people collapse, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, as impatience, anxiety, compulsive thinking, and emotional leakage begin to surface, exposing how dependent they still are on stimulation to feel stable. The quiet room test is unforgiving because it does not provide feedback. It does not reassure you that you are doing well. It does not reward effort with applause or progress bars. It simply reflects your internal state back to you with brutal accuracy. And this reflection is uncomfortable for those who have never learned to regulate themselves without external input, because in the absence of noise, the mind turns on itself, replaying conversations, rehearsing imaginary conflicts, generating worries that feel urgent despite having no immediate relevance. And this mental agitation is often mistaken for productivity or intelligence, when in reality it is simply unmanaged attention searching for something to attach to. The samurai recognizes this moment not as a problem but as a test, because the quiet room reveals whether silence has been internalized or merely tolerated, whether mental steel has been forged or only theorized. And the difference is felt immediately, because a trained mind experiences quiet as space, while an untrained mind experiences it as pressure.
And that pressure exposes the fault lines, the places where identity is still tied to validation, where self-worth is still outsourced, where discomfort still demands immediate relief. Many people believe they are disciplined because they can work hard when motivated or focused when conditions are ideal, but the quiet room strips away these supports, leaving only the raw ability to remain present without stimulation. And this is why so few pass the test, because it requires nothing active, nothing impressive, only the ability to stay without fleeing, to sit without numbing, to exist without distraction. And this is far more difficult than action, because action provides cover, while stillness offers none. In the quiet room, time stretches, minutes feel longer, thoughts feel louder, and the absence of external reference points makes internal states more vivid. And this amplification is what causes collapse, because the mind, unaccustomed to such clarity, attempts to regain control by generating urgency, inventing tasks, or reaching for devices, anything to reintroduce noise and regain the illusion of stability. And each time this happens, the conditioning is reinforced, teaching the nervous system that silence is intolerable and escape is necessary. But the samurai does the opposite. They recognize the urge to escape as the test itself, not something to obey, and by staying through it, they weaken the association between discomfort and danger. The quiet room also exposes attachment to identity, because without interaction, roles dissolve. There is no one to impress, no one to disagree with, no one to be seen by. And this absence can feel disorienting for those whose sense of self depends on external reflection, because when the mirror is removed, they are left unsure of who they are, and this uncertainty often manifests as restlessness or anxiety. But the samurai uses this disorientation as an opportunity, not to rebuild identity immediately, but to sit in the absence of it, because identity that collapses in silence was never stable to begin with. And allowing it to dissolve creates the space for a more grounded sense of self to emerge, one based on internal standards rather than social reinforcement. Another aspect of the quiet room test is emotional leakage, the tendency for unprocessed emotions to surface when there is no distraction to contain them. And this can be unsettling, as sadness, anger, or frustration appear without a clear external cause, leading many to believe something is wrong, when in fact something is finally being addressed, because emotions that are consistently avoided through noise do not disappear, they accumulate, and silence removes the lid, allowing pressure to release. And while this release can feel destabilizing at first, it is necessary for long-term stability, because suppressed emotion creates brittleness, while processed emotion creates resilience. The samurai does not rush this process, does not try to fix or analyze what arises, but allows it to exist fully, observing without judgment, understanding that the quiet room is not asking for solutions, only presence. And through repeated exposure, the intensity of these emotional surges diminishes, not because they are suppressed, but because they are integrated, losing their power to hijack behavior. The quiet room also reveals the quality of attention, because without external anchors, attention either stabilizes or fragments, and for most people it fragments, jumping rapidly between thoughts, memories, and fantasies, unable to rest on any one object for long. And this fragmentation is exhausting, yet familiar, because it mirrors the constant switching encouraged by modern environments. But in silence, the cost becomes obvious, because there is nothing to distract from the fatigue it creates. And the samurai uses this awareness to train attention deliberately, gently returning it to the present moment whenever it wanders, not with force, but with consistency. Understanding that attention, like muscle, strengthens through repeated redirection rather than intensity. Passing the quiet room test does not mean achieving perfect calm or emptying the mind. Those are myths that create unrealistic expectations and unnecessary frustration. It means remaining intact under stillness, maintaining composure without stimulation, and allowing internal processes to unfold without interference. And this integrity is subtle, not dramatic, but it has profound implications, because a person who can remain stable in silence can remain stable anywhere, in crowds, under pressure, during conflict, because their equilibrium is not dependent on external conditions. Society rarely values this capacity because it is invisible and unmarketable. There is no metric for it, no public display, and so many never train it, focusing instead on visible achievements that crumble under stress. But the samurai knows that the quiet room test is where true readiness is measured, because it reveals whether discipline has been internalized or merely performed, whether strength is intrinsic or conditional. There is also a deeper layer to this test that emerges over time, where silence stops provoking discomfort and starts revealing insight, not in the form of sudden revelations, but as a steady understanding of patterns, habits, and tendencies that were previously obscured by noise. And this insight allows more precise self-correction, because you cannot change what you cannot see, and silence sharpens vision. The quiet room becomes a place of calibration, where the samurai checks alignment, noticing subtle deviations before they become problems, adjusting course quietly without drama. And this ongoing calibration prevents collapse not only in silence, but in life, because it builds a habit of self-awareness that operates continuously, not only in crisis. Many people fear the quiet room because they associate it with loneliness or emptiness, but this fear is a projection, not a truth, because loneliness arises from disconnection, while silence, when approached with presence, creates connection with self, and emptiness is only experienced when expectations are constant stimulation. But when expectations change, quiet reveals fullness, a sense of grounded existence that does not require constant input to feel real. The samurai understands that the quiet room is not something to escape once mastered, but something to revisit regularly, because mental steel, like physical strength, requires maintenance, and without periodic exposure to silence, reactivity can creep back in unnoticed, eroding stability over time. And so the samurai treats quiet rooms as checkpoints, not retreats, places to test and refine internal condition. Passing the quiet room test does not make one immune to stress or emotion. It makes one resilient to them, capable of experiencing intensity without fragmentation, and this resilience is what allows action to be taken decisively when needed, without hesitation or overthinking, because the mind is not cluttered with unresolved noise. In the end, the quiet room test is simple but ruthless. It asks only one question: can you remain present without stimulation, without validation, without escape? And most people answer without realizing it, every time they reach for noise when silence appears. But the silent samurai answers differently, by staying, by breathing, by allowing, and in doing so, they transform silence from a threat into a proving ground. And the quiet room, once feared, becomes a place of strength, a place where collapse is replaced by composure, and where the foundations of unshakable presence are quietly reinforced.